She was my tutor, but every lesson felt like a secret only we could share. The day I first met her, I remember walking into the study with a mix of nervous anticipation and quiet curiosity. The room was small but inviting, the scent of old books mingling with something floral and warm, her perfume, perhaps, that seemed to linger in the air long after she moved. Sunlight filtered through half-closed blinds, dust motes drifting lazily like tiny sparks in the golden light. Everything about the space felt alive, intimate, and somehow carefully curated, as if the room itself reflected her, poised, elegant, and quietly commanding attention. I was early, fumbling slightly with the strap of my bag, and she was already there, seated behind her polished oak desk. She looked up as I entered, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. She was captivating. Not just in appearance, though her graceful posture and the calm confidence in the way she held herself were impossible to ignore, but in the air of quiet authority she carried. Her hair was pinned back loosely, a few strands falling softly around her face, and her eyes, calm yet curious, examined me in a way that felt more like recognition than judgment. "Hello?" she said, her voice warm, a little husky with restraint. "You must be my new student." There was a subtle smile playing on her lips, and it had a curious effect on me. I felt both at ease and self-conscious, acutely aware of every movement I made. I nodded, attempting to return the greeting without making it obvious that my heartbeat had picked up. She rose to shake my hand, and I noticed the strength in her grasp, tempered with a gentleness that was almost disarming. Her touch lingered briefly, enough to spark a flutter of unexpected awareness in me. I caught myself staring for a moment too long, but her attention had already moved to the neatly arranged materials on her desk, as if nothing had happened. Yet, in that small, shared gesture, something unspoken passed between us, a quiet acknowledgement of curiosity, the kind that grows slowly but leaves a lasting impression. She motioned toward the chairs by the desk. "Why don't we start by getting to know each other?" she suggested, her tone light but encouraging. Her confidence was magnetic, yet there was a subtle softness in her demeanor, a quiet vulnerability that made her seem approachable. Sitting across from her, I felt a strange mix of excitement and hesitation. Every detail of her, the way her fingers lightly tapped a pen, the gentle tilt of her head when listening, the warmth radiating from her presence, seemed magnified, as though the world outside had faded to a blur. It was impossible not to notice how natural it felt to be near her, yet equally impossible to ignore the quiet awareness that lingered in my chest. Something about her, the way she carried herself, the softness in her voice, the way she smiled just enough to invite trust without revealing everything, it demanded attention, drew me in. I left that first encounter feeling simultaneously grounded and unsteady, as though I'd glimpsed the start of something delicate, beautiful, and unspoken, a connection that promised more than lessons in books could ever teach. By the time I left, the room felt strangely alive with anticipation. And in the quietest corner of my mind, a thought took root, a whisper of curiosity I couldn't quite shake. There's something about her, and I can't wait to learn more. The first lesson wasn't just about the subject she was teaching. It quickly became something more, something quietly magnetic. The room felt smaller than I remembered, the afternoon sunlight now filtering in softer and warmer, dust motes dancing lazily in the golden beams. She had arranged the desk neatly with papers and books, yet it wasn't the organization that held my attention, it was her presence. She moved with a fluid grace, bending slightly over the table to show a diagram, the scent of her perfume mingling with the faintly musty pages of the textbooks. "Here," she said, her voice gentle yet firm, guiding my hand as I tried to trace the notes. Her fingers brushed mine, fleetingly at first, but long enough to make me aware of the warmth and softness of her skin. I tried to focus, but it was impossible to ignore the electricity of that moment, the subtle way our proximity created a tension neither of us acknowledged aloud. My pulse quickened, and I had to remind myself to breathe. As she leaned closer to explain, her hair fell forward slightly, brushing my shoulder. The contact was accidental, yet deliberate enough to leave a lingering warmth in its wake. I was aware of the curve of her neck, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she spoke, and the soft hum of her voice resonating in the quiet room. Every small movement seemed amplified, the tilt of her head, the slow blink of her eyes, the way she adjusted her posture to make sure I could see clearly. I felt both nervous and strangely comforted, caught in a tide of admiration, curiosity, and a hesitant longing I hadn't expected to feel during a tutoring session. She paused, noticing my distracted gaze. "Are you following along?" she asked softly, a hint of amusement in her tone. I nodded, suddenly aware of the intensity of my stare, and she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. It wasn't teasing, it was warm, observant, and perceptive, as if she could see the jumble of thoughts and emotions running through me without me saying a word. Throughout the lesson, touches were small but charged, her hand brushing mine to correct my grip, her shoulder occasionally touching mine as she leaned over to point at a detail. I found myself acutely aware of her presence, the warmth, the subtle scent, the way her eyes held mine just long enough to make my chest tighten. Each gesture, each glance, seemed to test boundaries without crossing them, leaving a tension that was palpable but unspoken. By the time the lesson ended, my mind was a whirl of thoughts and sensations. I left the room feeling a strange mixture of exhilaration and restraint, aware that something was stirring between us, a quiet, electric curiosity that neither of us had named yet. And though nothing had been spoken beyond the lesson itself, I knew this encounter had changed everything. It had shifted the dynamic subtly, hinting at the uncharted territory ahead. After the first few lessons, I began to notice her beyond the confines of the study. It started with small, almost incidental encounters. A quick wave in the bookstore aisle where she was carefully selecting novels, the faint smile she offered when our paths crossed at the coffee shop. These moments, though brief, carried an unexpected weight, and I realized that my awareness of her had grown sharper, more attuned. It wasn't just admiration anymore. It was the beginning of something quietly magnetic, a tension that hovered beneath the surface of ordinary interactions. One afternoon, I spotted her by the display of stationery, flipping through notebooks with her usual poised grace. Her hair caught the sunlight, a soft chestnut glow that seemed almost unreal in its warmth. She glanced up, caught my gaze, and for a moment, we lingered in a silent acknowledgement of each other's presence. I felt a flutter, that same mix of anticipation and hesitation from our first lesson. As I approached, I noticed a faint perfume that had already become strangely familiar, like a soft memory etched into the air around her. We exchanged casual greetings, and I found myself wanting to prolong the interaction. She asked about a book I had recently borrowed, her curiosity genuine and kind. Our conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by small gestures, a shoulder brush as she leaned to read a spine, a hand lightly grazing mine as we reached for the same notebook. The touches were fleeting, almost accidental, yet each sent a ripple of awareness through me, a quiet reminder of the tension that lingered beneath the surface. Later, over coffee, I observed her laughter, soft, unrestrained, with the faintest sparkle in her eyes, and felt an odd mix of awe and comfort. She listened intently, leaning slightly forward, her hand resting near mine on the table. There was a magnetic pull in her attentiveness, a warmth that drew me in while also demanding careful thought. I realized she had a way of making ordinary moments feel significant, a subtle yet undeniable influence that left me both grounded and restless. Throughout these casual encounters, I became increasingly aware of the contrast between us, my youthful eagerness, my nervous energy, and her calm, composed confidence that seemed effortlessly in place. Yet despite the differences, there was a growing intimacy, not through words alone, but through shared presence, subtle gestures, and the quiet acknowledgement of a connection developing in real time. By the end of the day, I left with a lingering sense of both satisfaction and longing. Each brief meeting felt like a step forward, each touch and glance a silent communication that neither of us dared to name outright. I realized then that the lessons extended far beyond textbooks. They were in the way she moved through the world, the way she observed, the warmth that seemed to radiate even in casual proximity. And for the first time, I caught myself quietly hoping that these ordinary encounters would continue, each one bringing us closer without either of us needing to rush or define the quiet, simmering connection. The evening of that lesson remains etched in my memory, the kind of quiet, golden hour light that made the room feel like a world apart from everything outside. The study was bathed in soft lamplight, the shadows warm and comforting, and the faint scent of her perfume mixed with the lingering aroma of brewed tea. I was sitting across from her, trying to focus on the textbook, but the words blurred as my attention kept drifting toward her, the subtle way her fingers lingered on the pages, the tilt of her head as she watched me struggle, the warmth radiating from her presence that made it impossible to ignore. "Are you sure you're paying attention?" she asked softly, a trace of amusement in her voice. She leaned closer, resting her forearm lightly on the table, the heat of her skin brushing mine. My chest tightened. I looked up, trying to meet her gaze, but found myself lost in the depth of her eyes. There was something in that look, a flicker of understanding, a hint of something unspoken, that left me breathless. I tried to speak, to ask a question about the lesson, but the words stumbled in my throat. Instead, I found myself saying something that surprised me even as it left my lips. I think I've been distracted by more than the lesson." Her eyes widened fractionally, and the corners of her mouth lifted in a subtle, knowing smile. She didn't speak immediately, she just let the moment hang between us, heavy with anticipation. Then, with careful gentleness, she reached over, brushing a loose strand of hair behind my ear. The touch was so simple, so tender, yet it sent a shiver down my spine. "It's hard to focus when someone is so intent on distracting you," she murmured, her voice a soft blend of teasing and sincerity. I realized in that instant that she felt it too, the quiet tension, the magnetic pull that had been building between us since our first lesson. We sat like that for a moment, the silence punctuated only by the soft sound of turning pages and our synchronized breaths. It was as if the rest of the world had disappeared, leaving only the two of us in that small, warm space. The lesson had stopped being about academics long ago. It had become a lesson in subtle intimacy, in understanding unspoken emotions, in recognizing that something fragile and beautiful was beginning to grow. Finally, she leaned back slightly, her hands still near mine. "I enjoy these moments," she admitted quietly, her eyes soft and steady. "More than I expected." My heart thudded, a mix of relief and exhilaration, knowing that my own feelings were mirrored in hers. The confession wasn't dramatic or loud. It was gentle, almost hesitant, yet it carried the weight of everything we had both been feeling. In that quiet acknowledgement, the tension we had been dancing around found its first clear expression, tender, intimate, and entirely electric. By the end of that evening, I left the study with a head full of thoughts and a heart that felt both lighter and heavier at the same time. The lessons had transformed, from simple tutoring into a delicate exploration of feelings, proximity, and the thrilling, unspoken possibilities that lay ahead. I knew then that our connection had crossed a threshold, and the path forward, though uncertain, was charged with anticipation and quiet, profound excitement. After the subtle confession in that quiet evening, the air between us seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. Yet, with new awareness came new hesitation. I found myself second-guessing every glance, every gesture, every word, unsure whether the warmth I felt from her was reciprocated or just a fleeting kindness. And she, I sensed, was carrying her own careful restraint, as if weighing the boundaries of propriety against the quiet pull she felt toward me. It started small. I noticed the faint coolness in her tone when she greeted me at our next lesson, a subtle shift from the soft warmth that had lingered the last time. Our usual easy conversation had a tentative edge. She lingered over explanations longer than usual, as though deliberately focusing on the lesson rather than the tension between us. I, in turn, found myself hesitant, careful with my words, wondering whether my lingering glances were appropriate, or if I had misread everything. Then came the whispers, casual rumors from acquaintances, subtle murmurs that hinted at impropriety, though nothing had been said outright. My own insecurities amplified each one, and suddenly our small, private moments carried a weight I hadn't anticipated. I began pulling back, just slightly, creating distance where there had once been comfort. The study felt larger now, colder somehow, the sunlight streaming through the blinds no longer warming me, but casting long shadows that mirrored my uncertainty. She noticed. How could she not? The way I hesitated at the doorway, the way my hand lingered on the chair before sitting, the way my gaze avoided hers for the briefest moments, all of it spoke louder than words. She didn't confront me directly. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch, testing me, letting me wrestle with my own uncertainty. I caught her hand brushing against mine accidentally when she passed me a notebook, and I recoiled slightly, though the warmth lingered. Every accidental touch became magnified, every shared glance heavy with meaning. Emotionally, it was exhausting and exhilarating all at once. I wanted to reach for her, to close the gap that had suddenly grown between us, yet I feared the consequences, the social judgment, the imbalance in our experience, the uncertainty of crossing a line that might never be uncrossed. She, too, seemed caught in the same tension, leaning toward me one moment, then retreating with a quiet sigh the next. Our connection, once fluid and natural, now felt like a delicate dance of advance and retreat, a test of emotional resilience for both of us. And yet, amid the hesitation and quiet conflict, there remained a constant, undeniable pull. In fleeting touches, in accidental brushes, in the warmth of her presence even across the room, there was the persistent reminder that this connection was real, fragile, and worth navigating. It was a lesson of patience, of understanding, and of the courage to feel deeply while respecting the boundaries that life and circumstance had set. By the end of that lesson, I left with my heart heavy but alive, acutely aware that our story had entered a new, more complicated phase, one where longing, restraint, and emotional honesty would be tested like never before. After days of hesitation and unspoken tension, our next lesson carried a different energy, softer, more deliberate, yet charged with the quiet thrill of anticipation. The study felt warmer than before, bathed in the late afternoon sun, golden light spilling across her desk and highlighting the subtle lines of her face, the graceful sweep of her hair, and the gentle curve of her smile that had always captivated me. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, comforting yet intoxicating, lingering in the air like a quiet promise. She greeted me with a warmth that was steady but measured, her eyes softening as if acknowledging the distance that had grown and was now shrinking. "Let's try something a little different today," she said, her voice calm, teasing yet intimate. I felt a shiver of anticipation as I nodded, aware that this lesson would be unlike any before. The work began, but it wasn't long before our proximity once again became palpable. She leaned closer to correct my hand placement, her warmth brushing against my forearm. Every small touch, guiding my hand on the page, gently adjusting my posture, was intentional yet gentle, creating a tension that made my chest tighten in a way I had missed during our hiatus. I was acutely aware of the faint brush of her sleeve against mine, the soft cadence of her voice, and the quiet rhythm of her breathing that seemed to sync with mine in the stillness of the room. There were moments of laughter, too, as she caught my mistakes with gentle teasing. When she brushed a speck of dust from my shirt, her fingers lingered on my shoulder, just long enough to leave warmth and a quiet flutter of awareness. I realized how much I had missed these interactions, the way her presence filled the space, the subtle intimacy in every gesture, and the way our shared focus on something ordinary could feel extraordinary. She paused at one point, letting her gaze linger on me as she asked softly, "Are you ready to try this on your own?" There was a challenge in her tone, but also encouragement, and I found myself smiling despite the nervous energy swirling in my chest. As I worked, I could feel her attention, her support, and the subtle closeness that had returned without a word of acknowledgement. By the end of the lesson, the tension between us had shifted. It was no longer hesitant or conflicted. It was steady, warm, and full of quiet promise. As she gathered her materials, her hand brushed mine lightly when handing me a notebook, a fleeting contact that spoke volumes. Our eyes met, and I saw in hers the same mixture of understanding, restraint, and quiet longing that mirrored my own. Leaving the study that day, I felt a sense of calm exhilaration. The lesson had been more than academic. It had been a rediscovery of our connection, a reminder of the intimacy that could exist in proximity, in small touches, in laughter, and in shared moments. It was a private lesson redefined, one where boundaries were respected, yet hearts spoke louder than words, and the slow-burn tension we had both been nurturing found a new, steady rhythm. The final lesson arrived like the quiet culmination of everything that had been building between us. The study felt different that day, softer somehow, bathed in the gentle glow of late afternoon sunlight that poured through the blinds, highlighting the subtle dust motes that danced lazily in the air. The scent of books, tea, and her familiar perfume blended together, a comforting and intoxicating reminder of the countless hours we had spent in this space together. I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and nostalgia as I stepped inside, aware that this lesson would mark a turning point, a moment of quiet resolution. She was already there, seated behind her desk, her posture elegant and composed, yet her eyes softened when they met mine. The familiar warmth was present, but it carried a new weight, a gentle acknowledgement of everything that had passed, every touch, every glance, every unspoken emotion. "Ready for today?" she asked, her voice calm but infused with subtle intimacy. I nodded, though my chest tightened slightly. The lesson, I knew, was about more than the work in front of us. We began, but the academic focus soon gave way to a quieter rhythm, shared smiles, soft laughter, and the comfortable proximity that had become natural between us. Her hand brushed mine lightly when handing me a pen, and for a moment, we both lingered in that fleeting contact, the warmth and electricity of it filling the space between us. Each gesture, small and deliberate, spoke louder than words. The way she leaned in to explain a point, the soft tilt of her head, the warmth of her presence close enough to feel, but distant enough to preserve the quiet anticipation that had always defined us. At one point, she set down her pen and leaned slightly toward me, her eyes locking with mine in a gaze that was both steady and tender. "You've done wonderfully," she said softly, her hand brushing mine as she handed me a notebook. That simple touch, a lingering warmth, a connection that needed no words, conveyed everything we had both been feeling. It was intimate without being intrusive, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had grown steadily over the weeks of lessons, glances, and shared moments. I realized then that our story wasn't about rushing to define a relationship or declare feelings outright. It was about the small, meaningful moments, the warmth of proximity, the unspoken understanding, the patience and trust that had built between us. When she stood to gather her things, I found myself instinctively offering my hand to help, and she allowed it, our fingers brushing in a gentle, deliberate contact that lingered far longer than necessary. As I left the study that day, I felt a sense of fulfillment and quiet exhilaration. The private lessons had ended, yet our connection had deepened in ways that words could never fully capture. We had navigated hesitation, misunderstanding, and longing, and emerged with a bond that was steady, tender, and entirely ours. In that gentle, lingering farewell, there was a promise of more shared moments, more quiet touches, and the kind of intimacy that grows slowly, carefully, and beautifully, leaving hearts forever altered. It wasn't dramatic or overt, yet it was perfect. The lessons were over, but the story of us, carefully and deliberately written in whispers, touches, and shared smiles, had only just begun.